Curtin Radio.
Well, this is an incredible story, this book. In fact, Canberra-based author who is joining us right now, David Cameron, has written this one, but he's also written several other books on Australian military and convict history and human and primate evolution, including 60 internationally peer-reviewed papers for various journals and book chapters. He's done international fieldwork in Australia, Middle East, Europe and Asia, and I'm very pleased to say that he's got time to join us. David, good afternoon to you.
Afternoon, Jenny. How are you?
Look, I'm fine, David. I mean, the more we hear about our history, the more we have to accept the fact that it was pretty gruesome, wasn't it?
Yes. Particularly the first couple of decades of white colonisation was pretty dismal for everybody, including Indigenous people.
Why do you think it was so extreme back then?
We've got to admit, back then it was almost like landing on the moon. Someone from, and I'm talking about white colonisation here, I'm not talking about First Nations people, obviously. The Europeans, Brits who arrived, the convicts and their administrations and the soldiers, it was basically landing on the moon. Very few would ever make it back to Europe, and I suspect a lot of them knew that. And it was a whole new environment, fauna, flora. It was really weird to them. They weren't sure what they could eat. And the crops and these livestock that were eventually settled there a few years after the settlement, most of that collapsed with the big flood of Nepean rivers and whatnot. And for a time, Australian colony was actually more based in Norfolk Island because of starvation in Sydney. So for the first 20 years, it was pretty dismal.
Well, I can fully understand that. I mean, geographically completely different from where they'd come from. But the thing was, morally, to be as brutal as they were, surely with the background that they had, they would have known what was right and wrong in behaviour.
No, it was man eat man, or dog eat dog. Basically, a lot of the people that were... most of the soldiers didn't actually do guarding convicts. There was some of that, but most of the guards ended up being fellow convicts. And in order to survive, they had to be the worst of the worst. And they knew if they actually went back in the convict ranks, their time would be pretty short because the convicts would get their revenge on them. But when you tend to get the worst of the worst rising to the top in situations like that. The meanest and the cruelest who become the convict overseers. Most of the guards were guarding the civilians and guarding ports and supplies, that type of thing. And they used the worst of the worst to actually be the day-to-day managers of the convict population. And unfortunately, you got the worst people rising to the top.
It was pretty lawless and it was open to incredible depravity. I mean, they were making laws and rules as they went along.
Oh, yes, they were.
Yeah, that's good. But didn't that get back to the old country, that things were pretty rough and pretty tough?
They were, but conversely, people in London, the reports from reports in the UK thinking that they had it too good at one point, like Port Arthur, not exactly a holiday camp. People were saying, they've got it too good, and people are going to Australia, and rather than being punished, they're actually being sent to places like Port Arthur. They're under the perception for some reason that Port Arthur was a bit of a holiday camp. So the perceptions, but the Chinese whispers, you start off in London, by the time you get to Australia and back, the Chinese whispers has turned everything around 180 degrees. So, Australia for the convicts and the early settlers was not a fun place to be.
That doesn't certainly sound like. Look, this book you've written, Convict Hell, like you've said here, the year 2022, this year marks the 200th anniversary of the establishment of the penal settlement at Macquarie Harbour. My gosh, it had a pretty heavy reputation, didn't it, as an earthy hell?
It was, and it was meant to be. It was basically set up for what was in Van Diemen's land, and those who actually did crimes after they were convicted. So basically it was for convicts who actually done crime or being a convict. And it was set up to be a hellhole, and they wanted everybody to know it was a hellhole because they thought, what if we establish this really terrible place, people won't do things because they'll be too scared to go there.
I'm just wondering whether, you can tell me whether this was sort of set up with that reputation for convicts back in the old country, or convicts that were convicted here in Australia.
Both. Made way on the convict ship over to Australia.
Yeah,
that's in the big hell, Macquarie Harbour. Some places they did talk about trying to do rehabilitation. They actually tried. They had that concept, and they had it particularly during the time of Port Arthur. The way they implemented it didn't work. But convict era, Macquarie Harbour, there was no pretense of rehabilitation. It was all about punishment.
Yeah.
And they made sure that... and they picked it because it was far away. It was isolated on the west coast of Tasmania, so theoretically that you couldn't escape because of the terrain and vegetation is just, it's so thick and mountainous. Not even Indigenous peoples would go into that area, into the hinterland, because it was just, there was no food there. It was just... or if there's food there, you couldn't find it, you couldn't catch it.
So these convicts, were they convicted of bad crime, or was it just the stories that we ever heard, loaves of bread stolen and that sort of thing?
Yeah, there was everything from like a jar of honey to handkerchiefs to murder,
Yes.
and rape, and everybody in between.
And all ages?
And most of the people that end up at Macquarie Harbour were, done for substantial crimes. But you only had to go into a convict situation and for something quite minor, and then within a couple of years you're really hardened and you're
Yeah, you live the life. What about women? Were they jailed this way?
Women went there for a while. They started there, and then because it was largely a male population, you can imagine what was happening there. And the women were sent back to Hobart within a year or two. A few did actually go back to Macquarie Harbour, but they were normally servants for the senior public servants. But they weren't sent there as prisoners, even though they were convict prisoners. They were there basically for servants, and they were kept away from the male, or tried to keep away from the male convict population.
Good luck on that one. You've described as earthy hell, which you've come up with all your, you've looked into this story, associated with inexplicable or irrepressible, I suppose, depravity, degradation and woe. My gosh, that's a big claim, isn't it?
Oh, it is. And people, around about 10% tried to escape, and most of those went into the bush and never came out again. And a number of stories of cannibalism. There's the famous Alexander Pierce story, which has been made into at least 2 films, I think. I know of one. I think there's another one. They started off with about 10 people, and Alexander Pierce was the sole man surviving. And not only did he survive and make it to near to Hobart, after along the way everybody got eaten and he was the only one left.
Oh, gosh.
He did it again. About a year later he escaped again. Didn't get far, but he also started cannibalising the person he was with. He ended up getting hung. But the first time they thought he was just lying, because he admitted, yes, I had to eat my colleagues. They thought he was just lying and saying that so the other men could... They pictured the other men had actually escaped, and he was just making up this story to cover their escape. Not realising the true story that they all started off together and along the way.
So can you visualise, or let us visualise, the sort of conditions they were living in and what their day-to-day life might have been?
Oh, it's shocking. Originally it was Sarah Island. It was originally tents and wooden barracks. Eventually they ended up putting up stonemason buildings there. That was about halfway through it. But I don't know if anyone's been to the area. The waters are polluted with natural vegetation and things like that, and very, very few fish species. There are fish there now that they're farming, cultivating. These guys, and they were mostly men, were originally working in coal mines. They were there basically as an industrial, not just for punishment, for industry, and it was an industrial site. And one of the main reasons was also because Huon pine was there, and it's one of the best timbers you can use for building ships.
Oh, right.
That's what the British Navy wanted, so they used the convicts to get this Huon pine. In the process of doing so, they had to fell these trees. They had to get them from mainland Australia. Sarah Island is right in the middle of Macquarie Harbour. They had to ferry the timber out of harbour. Then they had to get into the water, which was tan brown. It was polluted. And they had to drag these logs up there and saw them and cut them. And the amount of people that were killed in industrial accidents. These guys were up to their shoulders or underwater at times, like dragging these timbers up and trying to saw them. The food was terrible. Dysentery and cases of getting smallpox broke out. It was just
absolutely a hellhole.
It's just the worst place you could possibly be. Towards the end, it became a little bit better because they knew they were winding it down. So all the really bad guys eventually back to Hobart, and the number of prisoners that we saw there weren't the worst type. But even so, that the last lot managed to escape to Chile by they're building a ship, and at convict Macquarie Harbour they built ships, and they were building a ship, and this ship was supposed to sail back to Hobart. It was going to be the last ship built there, but the settlement closed down before the ship was finished, and the commandant left a couple of soldiers there saying, right, when the ship's finished, just sail to Hobart.
And they didn't.
And, what happened is the convicts, obviously some of them were seamen because they commandeered the ship and they sailed it to Chile. And they burnt the ship, and then they sailed ashore, saying that they were British shipwreck victims. And of course, then they went to the pub, had a few beers too many, and started mouthing off that they'd escaped from convict Macquarie Harbour, and then quickly found themselves on the first British ship passed by, and ended up at Norfolk Island, which was probably it was at least equivalent to Macquarie Harbour.
Yeah, I'd heard that. There's quite a story about Norfolk Island, isn't there?
Oh, there is. Yeah. That's not as bad as Port Arthur. Out of the three, Port Arthur was the best to be at. Don't get me wrong, no, you wouldn't want to be there for money, but out of the three, Macquarie Harbour and Norfolk Island were just really bad, and Port Arthur's just below them.
So you said, David, things started to get a little bit better. When did they start to get much better, if they ever did?
About 1832, 33, when Port Arthur was now coming online. Port Arthur is very close to Hobart. And Macquarie Harbour was just they realised it was just too far away. The administration, they couldn't administer the place. And they realised that most of the hue and pine that they could get access to was gone. So rather than being self-sufficient, self-sustaining, it was actually costing them a lot of money. So they decided to build a place closer to Hobart that could be administered. And again, it was supposed to be an industrial site that would be self-sustaining and self-funding. Turned out to be Port Arthur. So just as they were finishing or starting to build up Port Arthur, they winded down Macquarie Harbour. And for about a year, coming up there, he was a pretty humane man. Perry Bailey, he was quite a decent chap, and he was able to walk around quite freely without guns or anything because the convicts respected him, treated him well, and most of the really notorious guys had already been sent back to Hobart, so it was a pretty fair existence by that time. Mind you, that was only for a year. And if these guys thought that when they went to Port Arthur, most of them ended up going back to Port Arthur, they thought they were going to have it just as good at Port Arthur. They were sorely mistaken because the regime was back in full swing when Port Arthur got underway.
Well, I tell you what, we should be happy with our life today, shouldn't we, even though we find problems. That's amazing. That really is. I can't even imagine having to live like... Well, we can't, and we don't, thankfully.
No, definitely not.
What are you working on next, David?
I've just finished 4 volumes on the Kokoda campaign, World War II.
Great, yeah.
So the first 2 are out. One's called The Battle for Kokoda Plateaus, and the second one's Battle of Sarava. Next one comes out next month. It's called Saving Port Arthur, which is fighting at the end of the Kokoda Track, and the last book's the Australian Advance across the mountains. And
wow.
There's 4 major battles that took place: Royal Creek, Templeton's Crossing, Ori and Garabi. And then I'm currently now writing 3 books on the battles for the Japanese beachheads, which is the Japanese positions that the Australians and Americans had to take immediately after the Kokoda campaign, with the Japanese landed in Papua. So each of those beaches is Sanananda, Buna and Goda. I'm writing a book on those.
As you would, David. just turn out another one. That's amazing. They're all available. Well, not all available, a couple, yep. So some are available now, aren't they, the first lot you mentioned?
Yeah, first 2 are, and then now because I'm an archaeologist by trade, we're looking at I'm writing a grant to the Australian Research Council with the Australian National University to do archaeology on the Kokoda Track. We're trying to identify the original track. Most of the people that walk the track today, about 40% of it is brand new or new. It's not the original wartime track. So we're doing a 5-year project to document the original track and also find the lost battlefields and and document all those. And well, hopefully, if we get the funding, we'll be doing archaeology at the Curtin Tracks starting here. Hopefully, fingers crossed.
Good on you. What a busy life you have, and what a great life. Thank you so much for sharing all that info with us too. Thank you, David.
Oh, thank you, Jenny.
Thank you. There you go. How about that, eh? It's called Convict Hell.
Curtin Radio.